upholding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
We've signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets. Were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration. Let me be clear on one fundamental point. The United States fully intends to be the world's preeminent leader in protecting the global environment.
Coming up, Technocracy News.
And good morning. This is Patrick Wood for Technocracy News and Trends. Today is April 8th, 2019. Workers around the world are in for a big shock as we see a new trend in China emerging. This type of technology will, I'm sure, catch on in other places around the world, if it has not already. The headline this morning is Big Brother in China is tracking workers with wearable tech. Employees have joined the surveillance state unwittingly. They didn't ask for it. But their employers are requiring them to wear GPS tracking devices on their wrist that monitor their every move in the field and turning them into essentially digital slaves. This is unfortunately the natural outcome of technocracy, that is, scientific dictatorship. The article starts out, quote, "We're on this road working, and it positions us. You're here 20 minutes without moving, and it knows it." This is how a street cleaner in one Chinese city introduced a new piece of surveillance equipment that the local sanitation company slapped on her wrist to track her work. The smartwatch doesn't just track her position. Staying 20 minutes in one place sounds an alarm. "Add oil," the watch chants, using a popular Chinese phrase of encouragement. Well, there's nothing they can do about it if they want to keep their job. They have to wear the armband. And I'm sure that this kind of thinking will spread. This is the kind of thing that that Amazon would probably be interested in, since it already tracks its employees down to the last little minute movement. But what does this leave for humanity to enjoy? I guess you work at the pleasure of your employer, but does your employer automatically have the right to turn you into a digital slave? Well, these are questions for ethics over time, if there will ever be an ethical discussion on these issues. Remember that Google recently tried to launch an ethics panel on AI, and it lasted a week before they pulled the plug. It was a disaster. And it wasn't a disaster because of the people that were on the panel, but only because all of the onlookers decided that they would swarm the panel in disgust over the people who had been picked. And everybody had their own little axe to grind. It was crazy. On another note, in the European Union, the EU is now moving aggressively towards a universal biometric national ID card. You say, that's shocking. Well, it may be. A number of their people already do have biometric ID cards, machine readable, but many don't. They want to change that. So I wrote, the trend for universal biometric identification is racing forward. Europe will soon add its population to the estimated 3.6 billion citizens globally that will carry a biometric national ID card by 2021. In addition, the UN, good old United Nations, has mandated that all humanity will be identified in the same way by 2030. Yes, this is an essential element to implementing global technocracy. This article starts out, the European Commission has proposed a host of new measures aimed at denying terrorists the means to act, which include the mandatory inclusion of 2 biometrics, fingerprints, and a facial image in all ID cards and resident documents for Union citizens and their family members issued by EU member states. According to the Commission's proposal, quote, up to 370 of the 440 million citizens in 26 member states and the UK do not issue ID cards. Yep, they will now. And the member states will have little to say about whether or not they implement this because it's being proposed in the name of denying terrorists the means to act. This is exactly the same kind of talk that's happening in America right now with new biometric schemes being hatched for the border. So instead of just seeking IDs for the immigrants coming into the country, or especially illegal aliens, let's just ID everybody, innocent citizens as well as everybody else. Let's just do it all. Well, in the midst of this, remember that the United Nations, which is the United Nations, they represent every country in the world to some degree or another. The UN's called for a global universal identification by 2030. That would mean essentially that they know everything about everybody on planet Earth. It might be useful at this point to remind you of the original Technocracy requirements that were written in 1934. They were contained in the Technocracy study course that became the Bible of the Technocracy movement. That document can be found, by the way, on the internet. It's been scanned multiple times and posted as a PDF file. You can go search for it and find it yourself and read it. But I'll remind you of 3 of those requirements. They only wrote 7 requirements for Technocracy. It's very concise, very precise requirements for Technocracy to happen. But number 5 in particular is absolutely stunning because it was written in 1934. And this is what it said, quote, provide specific registration of the consumption of each individual, plus a record and description of the individual. That's it. So they wanted to know everything about everybody in the system. And, of course, they didn't have the technology to do that exactly back in 1934. They do today, and they're working hard to make sure everybody gets identified and plugged into the system. The last story in the news today is a call for the special drawing rights, or SDR, issued by the International Monetary Fund as a true global currency. And the headline I put on this story is Call for SDR as True Global Currency is a red herring. And I expect I'm going to take some flack on this because everybody else is writing about, oh my gosh, a world currency. They're finally going to do it. They're going to create that global economic touchstone of a global currency. Well, people are running off mostly in ignorance, not knowing the history behind the SDR, and not understanding how things work with the global elite. But my comment on this story is important, so I'll spend a little extra time on it. I said the SDR has been around for over 50 years and is structurally incapable of becoming the world's true global currency. Thus, the story by a globalist academic and high-ranking UN official is a red herring meant to deflect attention away from fintech that is expected to finance the green economy, aka sustainable development and technocracy. We, that is Professor Anthony Sutton, the late Professor Anthony Sutton, and myself, wrote about SDRs and Bancor in the 1970s. It never caught on then, and there's no reason that it will catch on now. The current pressure on global finance is to scrap all national currencies. Since SDRs are based on a basket of those currencies, which they are, they will be worthless as well. That's pretty logical. Now, the guy who wrote this article was a professor, or is a professor, at Columbia University, and also a United Nations official. And he touts the old party line that we wrote about from the Trilateral Commission way back when, in the 70s. And he says, this year, the world commemorates the anniversaries of two key events in the development of the global monetary system. The first is the creation of the International Monetary Fund at Bretton Woods 75 years ago. The second is the advent, 50 years ago, of the special drawing rights, SDR, and the IMF's global reserve asset. And he goes on to explain the whole process, and he gets down to the point where he says, the idea of a global currency is not new. Prior to Bretton Woods negotiations, John Maynard Keynes suggested Bancor, this was 75 years ago, folks, suggested Bancor as the unit of account of his proposed international clearing union. In the 1960s, under the leadership of the Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin, other proposals emerged to address the growing problems created by the dual dollar-gold system that had been established at Bretton Woods. So 75 years ago, John Maynard Keynes proposed Bancor as a universal currency. It was rejected 75 years ago. The Trilateral Commission resuscitated this in 1973 and called again for a modified Bancor to be used as a global reserve currency. It failed again. Now, there is such a thing as the special drawing rights today at the IMF, and they are used in certain transactions of global trade. So it is there, it is functioning, but the question, will it become a global reserve currency? Not a chance. There's nothing that's changed in 75 years that would commend Bancor, much less the SDR, which was created later, to have any role ultimately in creating a global currency. Now, what we see in technocracy, is we look at it through the lens of sustainable development, the entire area of fintech, financial technologies, with advanced technology, of course. Fintech has been hailed as the financing mechanism for sustainable development. That's not going to change. The world is piling on, if you will, to develop the fintech area. That will include, as we've already discussed in other articles, some type of blockchain currency that will most likely be managed by the central banking system. The global elite certainly know that currencies are running out of steam in the current economic system. What do I mean by that? Well, when the central bank system really got its kickstart back in the early 1900s with the creation of the Federal Reserve System, the central bank set up a mechanism for debt financing, creating currency for national governments. And this system grew quickly around the world, established itself quickly. And all the countries of the world all of a sudden had a central bank that was essentially a commercial bank, but it was a central bank that only had one client, and that was that nation. And then we had the development of a central bank to central banks called the Bank for International Settlements, which is in Basel, Switzerland, and arguably one of the most powerful policy centers on the planet. All unelected, of course, all unaccountable as well. So the banking system that was set up, debt-based banking system, had a limited lifespan, depending on how much inflation would take place over a period of time. You can only milk so much out of a currency system before you've milked it all. Just think of the example of a milk cow. You can only get so much milk out of a cow. After the milk is gone, there's no reason to keep pumping. Go on to a different cow, I guess. But in this case, the national currencies around the world have been inflated into oblivion. One statistic I saw probably about a year ago said that the dollar has been inflated by almost 99%. In other words, 99% of the value of the dollar originally has been shaved off and put into the hands of other people. So what's left? Well, 1%. Is going after that 1% worth the effort of a global currency system that is on the brink of failing anyway because of massive debt around the world? It's absolutely unsustainable, to use a pun from the United Nations. It is unsustainable. And so there's going to come a time when the global elite let go of the current debt-based financial system. They'll have to. They'll be forced into it. If they don't do it voluntarily beforehand, they'll be forced into it at some point. But I don't think this is lost on the global banksters and the global elite in general. Something new is coming. That something new, we already know economically, is sustainable development. It's everywhere. The United Nations has made sure of that, and members of the Trilateral Commission have made sure that it got fed to the United Nations lock, stock, and barrel through Agenda 21 policies created in 1992 at Rio de Janeiro. So the new thing coming is going to be fintech. It's not going to be some archaic 75-year-old scheme that was dreamed up by John Maynard Keynes. So this economist that wrote this article has a pipe dream. Perhaps he's just stuck in history. Perhaps he's an old school guy that doesn't realize that things have moved on. Or perhaps he's just floating a red herring on purpose just to get all of the alternative media people and economic doomsayers to have a conniption fit. Well, we'll see. I could be wrong, but I'll bet you in the end of it, I'll be more right than wrong. Well, that's it for today. I'm Patrick Wood for Technocracy News and Trends. I hope you head over to Technocracy News and read all the stories there. And if you have an opportunity and have not read my book, Technocracy Rising, or The Hard Road to World Order, I hope you'll pick up a copy and do so soon. It's important to understand these new global memes. Have a great day.